The night rain in Los Angeles was relentless. Torrential downpours swept through the bright neon-lit avenues of downtown, pouring onto the cold asphalt to create blurred streaks of light reflected from the towering skyscrapers. The wind howled between the concrete canyons, carrying the bitter chill of the Pacific Ocean. It drowned out the frantic, distant hum of traffic in a city that never truly slept. In a deserted corner of the street, beneath the tattered canvas awning of a smoking food truck, Taraji sat huddled on a rusted metal chair. She laced her 10 fingers tightly together, pressing her palms against each other, trying to find some meager warmth in the bone-chilling cold of the California night. She wore an oversized gray hoodie, worn thin at the elbows, which she had bought for a few dollars from a Goodwill thrift store. Her faded jeans were frayed at the cuffs, and her cheap sneakers were completely covered in dark mud from walking through the puddles. A stained canvas bag sat casually on her lap, looking so light and limp it seemed as though it held nothing of value in this world. Her eyes stared blankly into the thick curtain of falling rain, showing a deep, unspoken exhaustion. It was the kind of weariness that comes to someone who has lived through too many emotional storms, someone who has spent years navigating a world full of hollow promises and superficial people. Tonight she sat here in the dark, deliberately stripping away every layer of comfort just to face the raw, unvarnished reality of the streets. She wanted to know if honesty could still exist when there was nothing left to gain. A beginning born from hardship. From a distance, a worn-out, clattering engine sparked to life, tearing through the steady, rhythmic patter of rain on the canvas roof. An old Ford sedan, heavily rusted around all four-wheel wells and blowing a faint cloud of white smoke from its exhaust, slowly pulled up to the curb. Its dim, yellowed headlights swept across the tiny taco stall before cutting out completely with a loud metallic shudder. Stepping down from the sagging driver's seat was Malik. He was a tall black man with broad, sturdy shoulders, but he deliberately hunched himself over, tucking his hands deep into the pockets of a faded, oversized sweatshirt and baggy jeans stained with grease. He stood awkwardly under the pouring rain, his boots soaking through as his hands shook slightly from the cold. He tried to count out 25-cent quarter coins, digging into his pockets to find enough change to stuff into the automated parking meter on the sidewalk. He wiped the heavy raindrops clinging to his thick eyebrows, flashed an embarrassed, apologetic smile at the food truck owner, and carefully recounted the few remaining coins left in his wet palm. Looking at him standing there, anyone would immediately think of a poor working man, a regular blue-collar laborer struggling to survive day by day in the middle of this unforgivingly expensive city. He stepped under the dripping canvas awning, pulling up a mismatched metal chair opposite Taraji. His eyes looked at her with an innate gentleness, but behind that warmth there was a sharp, lingering hint of caution. It seemed he, too, was a person covered in invisible scars from past heartbreaks, someone who had learned the hard way to protect his vulnerabilities from the world. Two lonely lives colliding. The two of them sat opposite each other before two cheap paper plates holding hot street tacos, the steam rising softly into the damp night air. The tattered, run-down space around them felt isolated from the rest of the massive city, creating an accidental sanctuary. Taraji gently wiped a streak of rainwater from the wooden table with her index finger, her eyes looking down at the rough surface as her voice dropped into a somber, quiet tone. She began to share fragments of her daily life, whispering that she was working 2 exhausting part-time cleaning jobs just to raise a highly sensitive 6-year-old son named Andre. The child, according to her trembling words, always withdrew into the quietest corner of his room, refusing to speak to strangers, and only knowing how to express his deepest fears through colorful crayon drawings, because he lacked the presence and love of a father. Malik listened intently, his chest tightening with a sudden, genuine surge of sympathy. He did not interrupt her story. He only nodded silently, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the food truck as he absorbed her pain. He then bared his own shared struggle, recounting how his Uber delivery account had just been temporarily deactivated an hour ago because a wealthy customer complained about a late food delivery during the storm. That single complaint made this month's rent money as good as gone, leaving him on the edge of eviction. The two of them just sat there talking for hours, sharing the darkest, hardest corners of their lives under the steady witness of the night rain. Silence occasionally drifted between their sentences, a quiet moment full of deep reflection and heavy with feelings that could not be named. They looked at each other through the thin steam of the food, trying to find a single piece of pure honesty from the person across the table. Who will be the first to truly open up? As the faint, comforting warmth from the hot street taco slowly spread through her trembling fingertips, Taraji's gaze inadvertently caught the deep, tired wrinkles etched around the corners of Malik's eyes. His genuine exhaustion suddenly dragged her mind back in time, pulling her into memories of the days when she had to survive in an entirely different world, a place where blinding camera flashes constantly covered up a multitude of cruel lies. She recalled the countless men who had briefly passed through her life in the heart of Hollywood's cinematic empire, men who always showed up with flawless, practiced smiles and wore impeccably tailored suits that cost more than a car, yet hid a bottomless black hole of endless greed deep inside. Those men did not approach her because they genuinely wanted to listen to the silent traumas she kept buried, nor did they come to share the heavy burden of her long, lonely nights. They merely viewed her as a shiny golden ticket, a convenient fast track to step into the glittering, exclusive circles of the upper echelon. They desperately hungered to stand beside her on prestigious red carpets under the blinding paparazzi lights, and ultimately sought to reach their greedy hands into the staggering numbers resting in her bank accounts. To them, she was never a fragile woman who needed to be fiercely loved and protected, but rather a staircase made of solid gold for them to ruthlessly step on to reach the absolute peak of fame and fortune. Glamour always comes with a devastating price. It was exactly those dark days drowning in toxic relationships that taught Taraji a life-or-death lesson about an invisible, lethal weapon known as financial abuse, a highly sophisticated trap that countless women fall into without ever realizing it. She vividly remembered an old ex-boyfriend, a textbook narcissist, who always started his manipulation with sweet, honeyed words, claiming he only wanted to manage her spending to build a secure, prosperous future for both of them. But right behind that fake, caring facade, he began to silently strip away her independence, relentlessly interrogating her over every minor grocery receipt, complaining about every single dollar she sent back home to her struggling family, and systematically freezing her out of making any financial decisions in her own life. He deliberately created a cruel, suffocating illusion that she was a weak, incompetent woman, someone who was utterly incapable of managing money and who would completely collapse without his daily dispensing of mercy and guidance. Furthermore, financial abusers push their victims into a total dead end by secretly opening credit cards under their names, deliberately destroying their credit scores, and systematically isolating them from friends and family so they no longer have a single escape route or anyone to call for help. That is absolutely not love or sharing. It is a ruthless psychological manipulation strategy aimed at stripping away a woman's voice, her self-worth, and her right to control her own destiny, turning her into an obedient, helpless puppet. If a man demands that you hand over control of your personal accounts, constantly questions your most basic living expenses, and makes you feel profoundly guilty for spending the very money you earned with your own blood, sweat, and tears, then that is the brightest red warning siren you will ever encounter. Never hand the keys to your life to someone else. A sudden, deafening roar of thunder from the distance violently jolted Taraji awake from her chaotic, dark memories, pulling her abruptly back to the freezing reality beneath the torn canvas awning of the roadside food truck. She blinked rapidly, gathering the emotional fragments that had just scattered in her mind, and refocused her gaze on the man sitting directly across from her in his soaking wet, faded sweatshirt. Malik was carefully tearing a rough, cheap paper napkin in half, silently handing a piece over to her so she could wipe the cold raindrops lingering on her forehead, a remarkably small gesture that carried an incredibly natural, unforced sense of care. He did not possess the calculated demeanor of a slick opportunist desperately trying to win over a wealthy woman for his own hidden benefits. He simply looked like a stranger trying to share a bit of warmth in the middle of a freezing winter night in the City of Angels, asking for absolutely nothing in return. The rustic, Unpolished sincerity radiating from his calloused hands and his deeply empathetic eyes caused an invisible crack to appear in the massive, fortified, defensive wall Taraji had built around her heart. She suddenly realized that sometimes the broken souls living at the very bottom of society possess a much more intact, compassionate heart than the ruthless elites who reign atop the towering skyscrapers of power and wealth. Looking at the careful, gentle way he shared half of a cheap paper napkin, she knew instinctively that this man was entirely willing to give away the absolute little he had left in this world just to make sure she was okay. True kindness cannot be bought with money. The quiet space between two strangers beneath the tattered canvas awning was suddenly ripped apart by the deafening screech of heavy tires skidding violently against the wet asphalt. A matte black SUV slammed on its brakes right next to the cracked sidewalk, instantly casting the blinding, icy glare of its high-beam headlights directly into the shadowed corner of the roadside food truck, dazzling the few scattered customers. Three massive men with intricately tattooed biceps bulging underneath rain-soaked leather jackets stepped out of the vehicle, projecting the arrogant, reckless demeanor characteristic of ruthless repo men who made their living collecting bad debts across the dark underbelly of Los Angeles. They took heavy, deliberate strides, ruthlessly stomping through the murky puddles as they headed straight toward the flimsy metal table where Taraji and Malik were sitting, radiating an aggressive, unconcealed aura of violence. Any casual observer could easily recognize this as a classic, heartbreaking repossession scenario, a cruel reality where those living at the bottom of society are constantly hunted down over overdue medical bills or looming eviction notices. However, absolutely no one in that grim alleyway knew that these three terrifying thugs were actually Taraji's elite, highly trained private security team, loyal professionals executing a flawless theatrical test at the secret nod of their female boss. She instinctively shrank back into her seat, masterfully pretending to tremble with uncontrollable panic as she retreated backward, her eyes widening in perfectly acted horror as she waited to see exactly how the desperately poor man sitting across from her would react. The final test had officially begun. The imposing leader, bearing a long, jagged scar running down his cheek, stepped aggressively forward and swung his massive fist, slamming it down violently onto the fragile metal table with such brute force that the two paper plates holding their hot tacos were launched into the air, scattering the food onto the filthy, mud-slicked pavement. He aggressively shoved a rough, calloused finger directly into Taraji's pale face, his voice dropping into a deep, guttural growl as he viciously threatened her, demanding that she immediately hand over a $2,000 debt for her 6-year-old son's overdue hospital bills, swearing that if she didn't pay up right now, they would instantly throw all of her meager belongings out onto the unforgiving street. Taraji flawlessly played the desperate role of a cornered, helpless single mother pushed to the absolute brink, bursting into loud, heartbreaking sobs as fake tears mixed seamlessly with the cold rainwater streaming down her intentionally dirtied cheeks in a display of sheer terror. Following the natural, defensive reflexes of a terrified and vulnerable woman, she hastily pressed her trembling body against Malik's broad, sturdy back, her small hands tightly gripping the coarse fabric of his faded jacket as if clinging to the only life preserver in a raging sea. Deep down in her cynical mind, Taraji had already fully prepared herself for the inevitable sting of disappointment, thoroughly convinced that any ordinary man, when directly faced with the imminent threat of a brutal beating, would immediately step back and abandon her just to preserve his own life. She had personally witnessed far too much cowardice from the glamorous, empty men wearing tailored designer suits in Hollywood, so she hardly dared to expect that a destitute delivery driver would willingly shoulder a massive, dangerous debt that just fell from the sky. The heavy tears rolling down her face in this intense moment were half a masterful performance, but the other half carried the bitter premonition of the inevitable betrayal of human nature. Trust was the most expensive luxury tonight. However, in stark and complete contrast to all of Taraji's deeply pessimistic predictions, Malik did not flinch, waver, or take a single step backward. Instead, the fierce, innate protective instincts of a mature, responsible man suddenly surged forward stronger and more intensely than ever before. Rather than panicking and running away into the dark night, He slowly and deliberately stood up straight, utilizing his tall, broad, and solidly built frame to completely shield Taraji behind him, his razor-sharp, ice-cold eyes staring directly into the faces of the three aggressive debt collectors without revealing even the slightest trace of fear. For one brief, fleeting fraction of a second, the overwhelming logic of a powerful billionaire almost won out as his right hand instinctively reached deep into his pants pocket, fully intending to pull out his phone and call the state governor directly to have these insolent thugs thrown into a maximum security prison immediately. But then, Malik caught himself just in time, suddenly remembering that his current disguise was merely that of a broke, deactivated Uber driver, helpless nobody who absolutely did not possess any social power to command the justice system. Silently grinding his teeth together to suppress his boiling rage, Malik slowly pulled a battered, frayed leather wallet from his back pocket, digging out every single crumpled, worn-out bill inside to produce his absolute last $200, which he firmly slammed down onto the soaking wet table. He raised his deep, steady, and unwavering voice, issuing an ironclad declaration to the dangerous thugs, telling them to take this cash for now, and promising that he would drive his Uber 16 exhausting hours every single day to grind out the rest of the debt for this woman, on the strict, non-negotiable condition that they do not touch a single hair on her head. Witnessing this incredibly broad, unshakable back and hearing the profoundly responsible, selfless oath of this complete stranger, Taraji's heavily guarded heart seemed to completely skip a beat as an overwhelming wave of genuine emotion surged upward, instantly shattering every defensive wall she had ever built. He gave away everything he had. The matte black SUV peeled away from the curb, its red taillights bleeding into the rainy Los Angeles night. The three fake debt collectors had played their parts flawlessly, snatching Malik's crumpled bills before vanishing into the dark, wet shadows. Left standing under the torn canvas awning, Taraji was trembling, but this time the profound emotion shaking her small frame was entirely real. She looked up at the towering, quiet man beside her, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he had just done. This complete stranger, a man who had to scrape together loose quarters just to park his rusted car, had unhesitatingly handed over his absolute last financial lifeline to save her from ruin. Without saying a single word, Malik gently took off his faded, grease-stained jacket and draped it over Taraji's shivering shoulders, absorbing the biting cold of the wind in only his thin t-shirt. The heavy scent of rain and cheap laundry detergent clung to the worn fabric, but to Taraji, it was the warmest, safest thing she had ever felt in her entire life. Tears, genuine and unstoppable, spilled over her thick eyelashes, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She softly grabbed his wrist, her voice cracking as she whispered that her cheap studio apartment was just a few blocks away, asking him to walk her home through the storm. The elaborate game of deception had to end tonight. As they walked side by side through the desolate, puddle-filled streets of the city, the flickering neon lights of closed pawn shops casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement, a profound wave of guilt washed over Taraji. She was a billionaire, a titan of industry who could buy this entire city block with a single phone call, yet she was actively deceiving the most honorable man she had ever met. But deep down, her fiercely analytical mind knew exactly why this extreme, theatrical test had been absolutely necessary. When you sit atop a massive financial empire, protecting your assets and securing your personal information is not just a legal precaution. It is a matter of pure, unapologetic survival. In the ruthless, predatory world of high society romance, love is often blinding, but asset protection must always maintain perfect 20/20 vision. Taraji had seen far too many brilliant, successful women lose absolutely everything because they trusted the wrong charming smile, prematurely merging bank accounts, or revealing the intricate structures of their private equity firms before truly testing a partner's moral core. The harsh, unspoken rule of wealth preservation is devastatingly simple. You must aggressively compartmentalize your financial data from your romantic life. Never grant access to your primary offshore accounts, never put a new partner's name on a real estate deed, and always secure your trust funds behind layers of airtight, impenetrable legal barriers until a person's true character is proven under maximum stress. Malik had just passed the ultimate psychological stress test, proving that his undeniable integrity was far more valuable than any black card or diamond necklace. He had chosen to protect and defend her when he believed she had absolutely nothing to offer but crippling debt and endless sorrow. Character is revealed only when the chips are down. The heavy rain began to slow into a miserable, freezing drizzle by the time they reached the edge of a run-down, neglected neighborhood on the gritty outskirts of downtown. Taraji gently guided Malik toward a dilapidated, brutalist concrete apartment complex, a miserable place she had rented exclusively to serve as a realistic movie set for her fake life. They walked up the worn, chipped concrete stairs, the flickering, yellowed fluorescent lights of the narrow hallway buzzing like an angry hornet above their heads. The stagnant air smelled heavily of damp carpets and stale cigarette smoke, a jarringly stark contrast to the lavender-scented, climate-controlled hallways of her sprawling Beverly Hills mansion. Standing in front of the peeling wooden door of her studio, Taraji paused, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, desperately trying to escape. She took a deep, shaky breath, nervously clutching the cold brass key in her hand, feeling the full weight of the confession she was about to make. She looked up into Malik's tired but incredibly gentle eyes, completely ready to tear down the massive walls of her own deception. She planned to push open that cheap door, sit him down on the frayed mattress, and confess everything about her fashion empire, her immense wealth, and the real reason she had dragged him through this painful charade. She opened her mouth, a heavy apology already forming on her trembling lips, silently praying that his pride wouldn't completely shatter when he realized the poor single mother he had saved was actually one of the richest women in California. The truth was waiting right behind that door. The cold brass key slid into the rusted lock with a harsh, metallic grind that echoed loudly down the empty, flickering hallway. Taraji pushed the peeling wooden door open, her hands shaking so violently that the rusted hinges let out a long, agonizing creak. She slowly stepped into the cramped, pitch-black studio apartment, reaching out blindly with her freezing fingers to flick the cheap plastic light switch on the cracked wall. The dim overhead bulb buzzed to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the bare, water-damaged walls and the heavily stained carpet. Malik followed closely behind her, his large, imposing frame making the small, depressing room feel even more claustrophobic. Yet his silent presence remained incredibly comforting. He quietly closed the heavy wooden door behind them, shutting out the howling wind and the freezing Los Angeles storm, leaving them completely alone in the suffocating silence of the cheap decoy apartment. Taraji took a deep, shaky breath, preparing to turn around and gently explain the intricate, painful reasons behind her elaborate deception. She wanted to tell him everything, to sincerely apologize for every single fabricated lie. But fate had an entirely different plan. As her tired eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering lighting, Taraji's gaze fell upon the far corner of the narrow room, and her heart instantly plummeted into her stomach. Her highly paid and usually meticulously careful executive assistant had made a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake when setting up this fake, poverty-stricken residence earlier that afternoon. The heavy, reinforced steel door of the massive wall safe, which was supposed to be completely hidden behind a cheap, tacky replica painting, was left swung wide open. It sat there in the deep shadows like a gaping, infected wound, completely exposing the staggering, blinding wealth hidden inside to anyone who walked into the room. Stacks of solid, glittering gold bars were piled haphazardly on the cold metal shelves, catching the sickly yellow light and reflecting it back with an undeniable, arrogant brilliance. Right beside the heavy gold sat thick, neatly bound stacks of high-value stock certificates bearing the imposing crest of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, all explicitly printed with Taraji's full legal name. It was a truly absurd, almost comical contradiction, a massive mountain of absolute financial supremacy sitting right in the middle of a miserable, rotting apartment in the absolute worst part of town. The ultimate secret was brutally exposed. Malik froze dead in his tracks, his wet, muddy boots squeaking slightly on the cheap linoleum floor as his sharp eyes locked onto the glowing, open safe. The heavy, grease-stained jacket he had just taken off to shield her from the rain slipped entirely from his grasp, falling to the dirty floor with a soft, pathetic thud. The profound, suffocating silence that instantly filled the tiny apartment was absolutely deafening. heavy enough to crush the air right out of Taraji's burning lungs. She watched his broad, strong shoulders stiffen, terrified that the honorable, selfless man who had just sacrificed his absolute last dollar for her was now looking at her with overwhelming disgust. He had risked his own physical safety and given away his very last financial lifeline to protect a poor, desperate single mother, only to be confronted with a literal vault of unimaginable, extreme wealth. The sheer psychological cruelty of this unexpected unmasking hit Taraji with the violent force of a runaway freight train, tearing down every single emotional barrier she had spent years carefully building. She could not breathe, she could not think, she could only watch him stare. She had pushed the test too far. Overwhelmed by a crushing, paralyzing wave of guilt and shame, Taraji's knees buckled slightly, and she collapsed heavily against the edge of the cheap frayed mattress. The tears that had been carefully calculated and manufactured earlier that night now flowed with genuine, uncontrollable anguish, streaming down her face as she buried her head in her trembling hands. She sobbed openly in the dead quiet room, a raw and ugly sound of complete surrender, no longer trying to maintain the strong, untouchable facade of a ruthless corporate titan. Through her gasping breaths and heavy tears, she forced herself to look up into his stunned, unmoving eyes, her voice cracking as the heavy truth finally spilled from her quivering lips. She confessed that she was not a broke, struggling cleaner drowning in medical debt, but the ruthless, untouchable chairwoman of the city's largest, most powerful fashion empire. She frantically tried to explain that the deep trauma of being hunted for her money by greedy men had driven her to this extreme, unforgivable paranoia. She begged him to understand that the deception was born out of crippling fear, not malice, fiercely hoping he could see the terrified woman beneath the billions. She braced herself for his righteous anger, fully expecting him to turn around, storm out into the cold rain, and leave her utterly alone in this gilded cage of her own making. Her vast fortune suddenly felt like the heaviest curse in the entire world. She waited for the executioner's axe to fall. The heavy, suffocating silence in the cheap studio apartment stretched on for what felt like an absolute eternity in the freezing air. Taraji sat trembling on the edge of the frayed, uncomfortable mattress, tears of genuine shame streaming down her face, fully bracing herself for an explosive outburst of righteous anger from the man she had just deceived. She stared blankly at the stained linoleum floor, listening to the steady, rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet in the rusted kitchen sink, waiting for Malik to finally turn his broad back and walk out into the unforgiving Los Angeles storm. She expected him to curse her name, to condemn the staggering wealth sitting in the open safe, and to slam the wooden door shut on this cruel, elaborate psychological game forever. But the devastating, final sound of the door slamming shut never came to break her heart. Instead, a strange, low sound broke the suffocating tension that was practically choking the oxygen out of the tiny room. It started as a soft, almost imperceptible rumble deep within Malik's chest, slowly building into a genuine, rich chuckle until he suddenly threw his head back and burst into full, uncontrollable laughter. His deep, booming voice echoed off the damp, peeling walls of the miserable apartment, violently shaking the very foundation of Taraji's meticulously constructed guilt. The executioner was laughing at the condemned. Taraji stopped crying instantly, her tear-soaked eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated confusion as she stared up at the tall, broad-shouldered man standing in his wet, faded sweatshirt. She had fully expected him to hurl furious insults, to aggressively condemn her immense fortune, or to angrily demand to know why she had played such a ruthless game with a poor, struggling delivery driver. She wiped a cold tear from her cheek, completely paralyzed by a profound sense of bewilderment as Malik slowly walked toward the open, glowing wall safe, shaking his head with an amused, brilliant smile. He did not look at the staggering piles of solid gold bars, nor did he care about the multi-million-dollar stock certificates from her prestigious private equity firm that were explicitly printed with her name. Reaching deep into the front pocket of his greasy, rain-soaked jeans, Malik pulled out a cheap, heavily scratched, $15 prepaid burner phone he had likely bought from a clearance bin at a local Walmart. He looked down at the pathetic, outdated plastic device in his heavily calloused hands, letting out another deep, resonant chuckle as he pressed his strong thumb against the back casing. The ultimate illusion was about to shatter. With a sharp, deliberate snap, Malik pried the cheap plastic battery cover off the back of the disposable burner phone, letting the flimsy piece of plastic drop carelessly onto the stained carpet beneath his boots. Hidden meticulously behind the small, rectangular battery wasn't a secret prepaid SIM card or a desperate stash of emergency cash, but a heavy, matte black rectangle made of solid, cold-rolled titanium. He slid the card out with extreme precision and casually tossed it onto the flimsy wooden table, where it landed with a distinct, heavy metallic clink that commanded absolute, undeniable authority in the quiet room. It was an exclusive American Express Centurion Black Card, an invite-only financial artifact strictly reserved for global billionaires, directly tied to an infinite, untraceable offshore account safely tucked away in Switzerland. Taraji's jaw practically hit the floor as she stared at the ultimate symbol of supreme, untouchable global wealth, resting right next to a $15 piece of plastic garbage. Malik casually dialed a highly encrypted, private number on the keypad, switching the burner phone to speaker, his tone instantly shifting from a humble, struggling worker to the cold, commanding cadence of a ruthless corporate emperor. The king had finally returned to his throne. The secure line connected instantly, and a crisp, highly professional voice answered, immediately addressing him as Sir with the utmost reverence and panicked urgency. Malik calmly instructed his senior wealth manager to immediately cancel the aggressive corporate takeover of this specific slum apartment building, casually revealing that he had planned to buy the entire city block just to ensure the struggling single mother he met tonight would never face an eviction notice again. Furthermore, he explicitly ordered his team to dispatch his custom-ordered, bulletproof Rolls-Royce Cullinan to this exact GPS location immediately, explicitly demanding that his private driver bring a heated cashmere blanket for his future wife. He hung up the cheap burner phone, tossing it casually onto the bed next to Taraji, who was now sitting completely frozen like a beautiful, terrified marble statue. The poor, struggling Uber driver she had just mercilessly tested with fake debt collectors was casually orchestrating multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions, while wearing clothes that smelled like cheap motor oil and rain. The chessboard had just been flipped completely upside down. Malik slowly walked over to the bed, sitting down right next to the utterly stunned, speechless fashion mogul, his warm, intelligent eyes locking onto hers with a profound sense of shared understanding. He gently reached out, using his thumb to wipe away the last remaining tear on her cheek, formally introducing himself as the sole heir and current acting CEO of an international shipping conglomerate that controlled half the cargo vessels crossing the Atlantic. He softly explained that he, too, had been drowning in the toxic, superficial dating pool of high society, constantly hunted by gold-digging opportunists who only wanted unrestricted access to his vast trust funds and luxury penthouses. He had put on the grease-stained jeans and driven that rusted, dying Ford just to find a single, genuine human connection that wasn't built on the hollow foundation of cold, hard cash. Taraji listened to his deep, soothing voice, her brilliant analytical mind slowly processing the sheer, ridiculous magnitude of the cosmic joke the universe had just played on both of them. A slow, tentative smile finally broke through the heavy shock on her beautiful face, replacing her tears with a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief and genuine amusement. They were two master manipulators completely outplayed by fate. Before the heavy, beautiful silence could settle between them again, Taraji looked down at her hands, her cheeks flushing with a sudden, intense wave of embarrassment that had nothing to do with her money. She bit her lower lip, letting out a soft, incredibly nervous laugh as she looked back up into his deeply affectionate eyes, deciding that it was finally time to clear the very last lie off the table. She quietly confessed that the highly sensitive, 6-year-old son named Andre she had been crying about all night under the food truck awning did not actually exist in the human form. Andre, she admitted with a sheepish, highly apologetic grin, was actually a massive, incredibly spoiled Maine Coon cat who currently lived in his own private, climate-controlled wing of her Beverly Hills mansion. Malik stared at her in total silence for 2 seconds before completely losing his composure, laughing so hard that fresh tears began to form in the corners of his eyes. The immense, crushing weight of their mutual deceptions completely evaporated into the damp air, leaving only two powerful, lonely souls who had finally found their absolute equal. The game was finally over. The freezing rain that battered the gritty streets of downtown Los Angeles finally began to clear, giving way to a crisp, calm midnight sky. Less than an hour after the unbelievable revelations in that miserable studio apartment, the heavy, bulletproof doors of a custom Rolls-Royce Cullinan glided open in front of a 3-star Michelin restaurant in the heart of Beverly Hills. The valet, dressed in an immaculate tailored uniform, rushed forward with a velvet umbrella, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the two titans stepping out. Taraji had shed her thrift store hoodie and was now draped in a breathtaking, custom-fitted haute couture gown, radiating the majestic aura of a true fashion empress. Malik walked proudly by her side, his broad shoulders filling out a perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket that completely erased any trace of the broke delivery driver he had played just hours ago. As they walked arm in arm through the heavy glass doors, the bustling, high society dining room instantly fell into a respectful, hushed silence. Everyone in that room knew exactly who they were, completely unaware of the absurd, beautiful journey they had just shared in the pouring rain. The masquerade was officially over. They were immediately escorted to the most private table in the magnificent dining room, a spot typically reserved exclusively for A-list celebrities and foreign royalty. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the pristine white tablecloth, illuminating the heavy silver cutlery and delicate hand-painted porcelain plates. However, instead of ordering the wildly expensive imported caviar or signature dry-aged Wagyu beef, Malik quietly leaned over and whispered a highly specific request to the bewildered executive chef. 20 minutes later, a parade of white-gloved waiters approached their table, carrying covered silver platters with the utmost seriousness. When the polished silver domes were lifted, sitting right in the center of the world's most expensive porcelain plates were two steaming, perfectly wrapped street tacos. They were identical to the humble, messy meal they had been eating under the leaking canvas awning of the food truck just a few hours prior. Taraji looked down at the simple food, a bright, genuine smile lighting up her face as she picked up the taco. They ate in comfortable, joyous silence, savoring the rich flavors that tasted infinitely better than any luxury meal they had ever experienced. It was a beautiful inside joke, a physical reminder of the night they stripped away their staggering wealth to find each other's unvarnished souls. True love doesn't need a price tag. As they raised their crystal glasses filled with vintage champagne to toast their unpredictable future, the heavy, invisible armor Taraji had worn for years finally shattered. She realized she no longer needed to hide her massive empire or fiercely protect her trust funds from the man sitting across from her. Malik looked at her with a profound, unwavering respect, completely unbothered by her immense power because he possessed the exact same absolute security in his own life. They had successfully navigated the dark maze of manipulation, greed, and paranoia that plagued their elite world, emerging with something priceless. They had found an equal, a true partner, perfectly willing to sit in the dirt and sacrifice their last dollar to protect them. The emotional scars left by the ruthless opportunists of their pasts were finally healing, washed away by the undeniable truth of genuine human sacrifice. A new dawn had finally broken. As we reach the end of Taraji and Malik's incredible journey, I want to leave you with a crucial life-changing lesson. In a world obsessed with massive settlements, towering penthouses, and flying first class, it is incredibly easy to build massive walls around your heart. Financial boundaries and asset protection are absolutely necessary, but you must never let the fear of being used permanently blind you to genuine kindness. Character is not measured by the numbers in an offshore bank account. It is measured by what a person is willing to sacrifice for you when they believe you have absolutely nothing left to offer. Look for the person who will stand in front of the storm for you, even if they only have a few dollars in their pocket. If you found value in this emotional story, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on Taraji's ultimate test. Your support helps us create more powerful stories just like this one. Never stop believing in unconditional love. In this story, we witness a completely different side of the elite world, a place where immense wealth often breeds crippling paranoia. Taraji and Malik's elaborate game of disguise wasn't just a romantic comedy of errors. It was a devastating reflection on the reality of financial abuse and the fierce necessity of asset compartmentalization. Far too many successful women fall victim to predatory partners who use charm to gain control over their bank accounts and destroy their independence. Taraji's extreme test reveals a profound truth. True character is never measured by the size of an offshore account, but by what someone is willing to sacrifice for you when they believe you have absolutely nothing. If you are navigating a new relationship, remember to protect your trust funds and personal data until your partner's integrity is proven under pressure. This story is a reminder that while asset protection is vital, you must never let the fear of betrayal blind you to the rare, genuine kindness that still exists in the world.